welcome to our webinar today, sponsored by Division 15 of the American Psychological Association. I'm David Morris, and on behalf of the webinar committee, Jason, Chen, and I are delighted to host our speaker for today, Dr. Daniel Willingham. Dr. Willingham is a professor of psychology and director of graduate studies at the University of Virginia. He's authored best-selling books, published articles featured in major media outlets, and currently writes the Ask the Cognitive Scientist column for American Educator magazine. His work, which involves applications of cognitive psychology to teaching and learning, appeals to a wide audience of academics, teachers, parents, and students. Much of this work is dedicated to exploring myths about educational psychology that are common in today's schools. These myths, he notes, reflect a larger disconnect between teachers and researchers that is not easily resolved through teacher education or simple appeals to authority. This will take the form of a traditional webinar in that Dr. Willingham will talk for around 45 minutes and then answer questions from participants. If at any point you have a question, simply type it into the Zoom chat box. Jason and I will monitor the chat box for questions and will relay them to Dr. Willingham after the presentation. The webinar is being recorded and will later be posted to Division 15's website. Welcome, Dr. Willingham.
Thanks so much, David. And thanks to everybody who's joining us. Appreciate your giving me some of your time. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here in the process that has become familiar to all of us in the last couple of months. So here's the title of the webinar that you signed up for, Truthiness in Educational Psychology. And I recognize that it sounds like what I'm probably going to talk about is educational myths, like what are the myths, and I'm going to explode myths and so on. That's actually not what I'm going to talk about. You may have alternatively thought that what I'm going to talk about is how we can convince someone who believes in educational myth how not to believe that anymore. So this talk would mostly be about persuasion. That's actually not what I'm going to talk about either. What I want to focus on is the question of why there are so many educators who believe myths about teaching and learning. So this is really large-scale focus, very much focused on systems. Here's the basic outline of the next 45 minutes. I want to spend a little bit of time just considering where we are right now. I made this sort of casual claim. There are lots of educators who believe myths about teaching and learning. What do we actually know about that? Then I'll talk about two commonly offered solutions to this problem of common acceptance of educational myths, some suggestions that this should be addressed in teacher education, and then some that people really just need to trust researchers. Finally, and as you can guess there, because I have a new suggested solution, I'm going to suggest that both of these common solutions are not very effective, don't show a lot of promise, and I'll offer a new solution. So let's start here. Let's consider where we are. And first, just to orient you, I think in this audience, everyone's pretty familiar with most educational myths. This is part of the reason I didn't really want to talk about that and explode myths, because you've already exploded them yourself, very likely. But I'm talking about things like the learning pyramid. I'm talking about the idea that kids today, we're raising a new generation of digital natives. They think about technology in qualitatively different ways than older people do. And in fact, technology has affected their minds such that they really think about it differently. These are just a couple of examples of the kinds of things I'm talking about. Now, the truth is, and again, this little section is called Where Are We? The truth is we don't have amazing data on the extent to which these sorts of educational myths are commonly accepted among educators. Here's a data set, one of the better data sets that was fairly comprehensive. And this was a survey that asked both members of the general public and educators to answer a large number of questions in endorsed positions or not endorsed positions. Here I've just pulled out some of the myths about teaching and learning. So things like learning styles, dyslexia, seeing letters backwards, and so forth. And you can see over there on the right-hand column, there's a pretty high percentage of educators endorsing a lot of these myths. They're doing better than the general public, but still certainly not where we'd want to be. So this is somewhat persuasive. It's also the case that this was a convenient sample rather than a nationally representative sample. So we would have some questions about it. So I do want to be somewhat cautious in suggesting that we have a really good idea of the extent to which there's very widespread belief among educators regarding neuromyths. But at the same time, we have to, I do want to say anecdotally, it's hard to find a lot of people who are ready to staunchly defend the idea that no, educators never believe neuromyths, and we're in terrific shape as far as that goes. So I'm more or less going to take it as demonstrated that we have good data indicating that there's widespread belief among educators in myths about teaching and learning. But I do want to acknowledge that I'm probably going a little bit beyond the data. Now, how do we think about this? Well, this is Division 15. This is the APA. There's a bunch of researchers. And our thinking generally corresponds to what you see on the slide. Well, you know, there's good science and there's bad science, or in some cases just absence of science. And the core problem lies in separating the two. Somehow we've got to make people better informed about what's good science and what isn't good science. So that leads us to the first solution that I sometimes hear offered in this context, which is this is a problem that should be solved in teacher education. In other words, teachers need to be better armed in order to evaluate educational research, and then they will not endorse neuromyths. They'll recognize these myths about teaching and learning for what they are. So in other words, we need to do more education by way of sort of arm people to evaluate research, more courses in methodology and statistics, for example, that kind of thing. I think this is not a very good idea, and there are a few factors that I think make it not a very good idea. So the first thing I want to point out is that during teacher education, scientists are not the only type of professor and type of course that teacher candidates are going to encounter. Schools of education have psychologists, but there are also historians. There are people from women's studies. There are philosophers. There are people with their background in critical theory. And this is as it should be. There are many ways to view the world, to organize the world, to make sense of the world. Science offers one way, but it certainly doesn't offer the only way. And it certainly doesn't offer the only way that's valuable for education. So what that means is that the experience of teacher candidates is that they are exposed to some scientific content, but they're also exposed to lots of other ways of thinking about the world. So suggesting that we're really going to ramp up the science and expose teachers to a whole lot more rigorous thinking in terms of how to be a scientist, I think neglects the fact that that necessarily means there's less time for everything else. And I don't know that that's plausible. And I also don't know that it's necessarily a good idea. A second factor that you could consider in this idea of trying to better arm teacher candidates to evaluate science are admission criteria. So a lot of times people will point to schools of medicine and say, well, they are doing lots of science and there's sort of a parallel there. Physicians are not going to be basic scientists, like teachers are going to be practitioners, but they need to know basic science. And so why couldn't you see the same thing with schools of education? I think this argument really moves too quickly. It neglects the fact that people who come into schools of medicine are admitted because they already have extensive backgrounds in science. And again, you got a couple of problems there. One is science is not the only thing, the only sort of lens through which to view the world that teacher candidates are going to encounter in schools of education. And I think we want to retain that. The other thing is that I don't know what the consequences would be if we really amped up our admissions criteria for the number of science courses that someone had to take before they entered into a graduate school of education. I think we would get people who probably knew more science, but I'm not at all sure of what else we might learn. Currently, that's not the number one reason that people become teachers, is because they got a lot of background in science and they're eager to do more science as applied to education. They would probably go to another program if that's what they were really interested in. The third factor is one of time, and I've already touched on this. Most teacher candidates are exposed to some core ideas in teaching and learning that are not myths. They're also exposed to some content about how to evaluate educational studies, but it's usually pretty brief. So most programs include a course in educational psychology, or they include a course in developmental psychology or foundations of education, and teacher candidates encounter this sort of content in that context. But we all know from other studies that a single semester course, you'll know more than you did if you didn't take the course, but you're not going to know that much. And I think the idea that from that one course, people are going to be able to evaluate new studies that they encounter is not very realistic. And so that means you're really going to have to increase the amount of time that people study this content in order to get the results you're hoping to see. So I don't think this is really a plausible solution to look to teacher education to increase the ability of teachers to evaluate the research they see and decide whether or not it's neuromyths. So the second idea is, well, okay, so this shouldn't be on teachers. And when you think about it, it's kind of funny anyway that, you're a practitioner and you're supposed to go home at night and read journal articles. I mean, that's just not very realistic. So the second idea is that you would just have researchers sort of telling teachers, okay, this is the viable research. Now, what we're suggesting here is really argument from authority, and I think it's worth elaborating exactly what that means, because it's going to show why this is a problem. Argument from authority basically means you should believe me because I know something that you don't know. And to unpack it a little bit, you would describe it this way. Proposition A is that Isabel has good scientific reasons for believing X. Proposition B would be Bill has good reasons for believing that proposition A is true. Therefore, Bill believes that X is supported by scientific evidence. Or to put it another way, Isabel's a scientist and she says X is right. Bill's not a scientist, can't really evaluate science, but he thinks Isabel knows what she's talking about, and therefore Bill thinks that X, whatever it is, has scientific backing. Now, when you put it this way, Bill seems kind of stupid. It's like Bill's saying like, okay, Isabel, if you say so, and Bill's not, why doesn't Bill grapple with the evidence himself instead of just taking Isabel's word for it? But when you think about it, we accept arguments from authority all the time. So when I go to my doctor and she tells me to do something, I usually just do it. I don't go home and look up the literature on it. I just accept her authority. Same thing is true when an electrician comes to my house to fix an electrical problem. Same thing is true when we not long ago put a deck on our house and we had an architect design it. I didn't ask for details about why it was that this was properly constructed. I just figured the architect knew what he was talking about. So the question is, what's the difference between instances when I'm going to accept authority, as in the case of my doctor and my architect, and education, where most people are not ready to accept authority? I'm going to describe three differences between education and instances where we accept authority. The first difference is that in the case of my doctor and these others, there's a reputable body that vets them and sort of gives them a license, literally, that attests to their expertise. So I know that unless my doctor is a criminal, she has passed the Virginia Board of Medicine's exams, and she knows what she's talking about. Likewise, you can't just hang out a shingle and say, guess what, guys, now I'm an electrician. You have to be licensed by the state of Virginia. Now, I, of course, don't look into very deeply whether or not that license is really, it's a good test and it's meaningful and so on. My experience and the experience of others tells me that for the most part, it seems to work. And that people who the state says are experts, most of the time are experts. In education research, that's not true at all. So anybody can, we don't have a licensing, nobody licenses educational researchers. Anybody can describe themselves as an educational researcher. And if they're slick, they can get professional development gigs and go into schools and tell people how they ought to be teaching. So instead, because there's not a license, what people tend to do is they look for earmarks of authority. They look for characteristics that they think are associated with expertise. And what happens is, because those earmarks are pretty easy to acquire or to fake, you get charlatans in the marketplace appropriating those earmarks of authority. So what you're looking at is a screenshot from a website that peddles medicine that's supposed to help ADHD. Now, this is not an effective medication at all, but this is the kind of, this is a homeopathic remedy. If you're familiar with that, homeopathic medicines are basically distilled water. But look at the kind of things that you see on this website. So you see somebody with a lab coat and a stethoscope. And you see that there's research that's cited on and so thing, and you even see the seal from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which, by the way, is not supposed to be reproduced anyway, anywhere. It's also hilariously, PubMed is, by the way, the guy with the stethoscope there, you see PubMed written. That is a database of mostly high quality and legitimate journals. And if you click that button, you in fact are taken to PubMed, where it, with a search of homeopathic remedies. And what, if you actually read the articles, you'll find that all the articles say homeopathic remedies don't work. But what I want to draw your attention to is how a mythological cure for ADHD is very careful to sort of assemble earmarks of authority. So this is difference number one between education researchers and other practitioners where we accept authority. Authority is accepted when a reputable body does the vetting. In education, nobody is vetting, and everybody in the marketplace can appropriate earmarks of authority. Second difference is that we are more likely to accept authority when we feel that there is a settled truth. There's a body of knowledge that experts have that's really worth having. So for example, in medicine, what you're looking at here is obviously the inside of someone's mouth, and you can maybe make out there's some sort of white spots there. These are Koplik spots. A physician who sees Koplik spots will say, this is an early indication of measles. This person is going to develop full-blown measles with the rash and so on within a couple of days. And our expectation is there's not going to be a whole lot of debate among physicians. There is a settled truth about how to interpret this. Likewise, when I have an electrician come into my home, I understand there's a few options about how to do wiring and how to diagnose it and how to solve a problem, but I also don't think there's huge variation in what different electricians would say. It would never occur to me when I greet an electrician at my door to say, so who would you say are your greatest influences as an electrician? I think there's just, you learn how to be an electrician and that's it. There's a settled truth. There's clearly not a settled truth within education research. This is a listing of a very small number of the special interest groups within AERA, and you can see I picked them out, of course, specifically because I think these folks would really agree that there's a settled truth. So you've got the brain, neurosciences, and education people, and then you've got the Marxists, and you've got the Confucius, Taoist, and the Foucault, and along with the multiple linear regression people. So the idea that all of the education researchers are going to get together and say, okay, this is what we know, is just completely unrealistic. Now, this, even within educational psychology, I think we really project the image that there's not a settled truth. We're still figuring everything out. So what this is three sort of major figures have different perspectives in learning. So if you go to an educational psychology textbook and look at what it has to say about learning, you will find the information processing view is exemplified by Endel Tulving, the behaviorist view as exemplified by B.F. Skinner, and the situated cognition view as exemplified by Jean Lave. These views are not compatible at all. They're extraordinarily different views of learning. The idea that a teacher candidate would read these radically different views of learning and say, oh, these are really interesting perspectives, and I'm going to come to my own sort of beautiful fruition of interdisciplinary perspective, it's a pipe dream. What a teacher candidate is going to think is, oh, okay, there's lots of different ways of thinking about this. They clearly haven't figured it out yet, and so they don't really know what's going on. So we accept authority when we perceive that there's a settled truth on which experts agree. In education, it's perceived that there's not a settled truth. Final difference is the role of the consumer. When we are ready to submit to authority, it's understood that you're sort of a fool if you don't do what the authority tells you to do. If I go to my mechanic and my mechanic says you need an oil change, and my response is, okay, well, that's an interesting perspective you're offering, but you know what? I sort of have my own intuitions about my car. Or if I go to my doctor and she tells me you need to change your diet, and I say, well, I'm going to use that as sort of a springboard for my own thinking about what my diet ought to be. Most people would say you're a dummy because this person has expertise and you ought to pay attention to them. So we're ready to pretty much surrender. Part of surrendering authority is not only believing what they say, but also being pretty ready to do what they suggest you do. And I think that's a striking contrast in education. This complicated figure on the left is just a very scripted lesson plan is what you're seeing there. So teachers are leery of surrendering autonomy to researchers exactly because they perceive that this is part of it. This is, if I accept the authority of this researcher, that means they kind of have the right to tell me what to do, and I'm not sure I want any part of that. So authorities accept this, understood accepting authority means doing as they say, teachers justifiably reluctant to do as authorities say. Okay, so in summary, and this sort of part number 2 here, researchers expect authority to be persuasive. We really know a whole lot about learning, like you should really listen to us. I think we don't have in place the conditions that are necessary to speak with authority. I forgot that I put that in all caps. I guess I was really persuaded of what I was saying at the time. Okay, so here we are back to the outline of the talk. That's the common solution number 2. Let me offer a suggested solution that I think might work better than the 2 that I've rejected. And it's grounded in this difference. So again, sort of going backwards in the talk, started with the idea, well, what if teachers sort of are responsible for figuring this out themselves? Sifting out myth from truth in science. And I said, that doesn't make any sense to me. I can see lots of costs. So that means it's going to have to be somebody else. Who's doing the figuring out. And teachers are going to have to listen to that person. I've just rejected the idea that it's going to be researchers. So I want to look at the reasons I said researchers don't have authority and use that as a starting point for a better solution. So that's what you're seeing on the slide now are these 3 reasons that I just went over. So let me take them in turn. First, let's consider who could be a valid authority. And what I suggest ought to be done is there should be institutions that are created by teachers themselves. That should be the basic authority. And I'll point out that this is mostly the way other professions handle this problem. This problem is not unique to education. This problem is common among professionals, because what happens is you go to school, you learn how to do your profession, and then you're out in practice. And while you're out in practice, most people would not expect you to be keeping up with the latest research. Instead, you're in practice, and that's what you're doing. And so somehow but research is marching on, so somehow you need to be caught up. And the way other professions have dealt with this is they create institutions that are created by the practitioners themselves, for example, the American Medical Association, who exert a lot of control on sort of updating the practitioners out in the, who are again, are sort of in practice. In the case of medicine, the AMA is able to exert so much control and is so powerful. I mean, think about it. Anytime something happens in the medical world, reporters call a representative of the AMA to find out what they think about it, right? So they're really seen as authoritative, so much so that you can actually have privately generated yearly updates. That's what the physician's desk reference is. Washington Manual of Medical Therapeutics, the Washington Manual, there are a bunch of them. You can see this one's in the 32nd edition. These are yearly updates. So if you're a professional, you're in practice, you get these sort of yearly summaries. Okay, here's what's changed in the last year as research has moved on. Have we changed the way we think about treatment for any particular disease or whatever it is? So this is a very powerful model where you trust an institution, and you're more ready to trust the institution because they're the ones who have hired the people who are vetting the research, and the institution feels like it's us. It feels like this is all of the physicians have gotten together. And of course, it's not a perfect model. There are definitely problems. But I think we would be much better off in education with this sort of model. Naturally, institutions that are composed of educators exist. None of them have shown a whole lot of appetite for doing this work, vetting research for teachers, communicating that research in a summarized, useful way for practitioners. The NEA and the AFT would be really the obvious candidates to do this, but they're really are functioning much more like labor organizations than like professional organizations. They're just not interested in taking on the job at all. IES has done some of this through the What Works Clearinghouse and also with their practice guides. The practice guides, of course, aren't updated. They're sort of static. What Works is, but it's focused solely on curricular materials and so on. And the other thing that I don't love about this is that it's the government. I'd much rather it were educators themselves who were in control of this. Okay, here's the second. Remember I said that I had these three reasons related to authority. Here's the second one. The perception that researchers change their mind, right? So this is, again, this point that even when we're trying to say, okay, you're in your first educational psychology course, here's what we know about learning, and then you see these three wildly different perspectives on learning, you can end up justifiably thinking, well, you don't know anything. If teachers are going to feel like educational research really has something to offer, they need to feel like it's really got something to offer. So what I suggest is that there needs to be much less focus on theories and more on empirical regularities. So here are just 4 items of the sort of things I'm talking about. Practice is crucial to gain expertise. Probing memory improves retention. Memory for specific episodes can be conflated with memory of generic episodes. Sleep improves retention. These are empirically demonstrated facts. These are findings that have been replicated again and again and again. The 3 researchers that you see at the bottom of your screen would all have to agree that these are facts that we know about learning. They would have different ways of interpreting them, but they would agree that these are things that we understand about learning. What I want to emphasize is that that's the stuff that's actually going to be of high utility to teachers. The theories are not going to be very useful to teachers. So the things that's sort of misleading teachers into feeling like researchers don't have anything to offer is not really content that's going to be very useful to them anyway. So instead, I think teacher education ought to focus much more on those sorts of facts that are in the list there. This is an argument I could get into in much, much more detail, the detail that would absolutely exhaust you. If you're interested, I've published it in several papers, this idea, and this being one of them, a mental model of the learner from Mind, Brain, and Education a couple of years ago. But this, one way or another, this is something that we researchers need to work on, is the perception that we're changing our minds all the time. Finally, we need to work on the perception that science limits the autonomy of educators. I used before a analogy to medicine and said, right, medicine and education sort of have this in common. You've got basic science, and then you've got practitioners, and practitioners are drawing on basic science and so forth. And one of the things I said can be a real problem here is that our perception is that physicians don't have the autonomy that we expect teachers to have. In other words, if you see Koplik spots and you diagnose something else, and other than treat something else, then you're going to get sued for malpractice. In other words, accepting science really seems to limit what you're going to be able to do. First of all, I'll mention that my friends who are physicians say, that's the public perception of how medicine works. It's not really remotely that cut and dried. I'm ready to believe them. I'll also say, in a sense, it doesn't matter that much because that is such a widespread public perception. What I'd like to offer as an alternative analogy is not medicine, but rather architecture. For an architect, you do need to draw on some basic science. You need to know some physics. You need to know some materials science in order to design a building that is going to stand and that is going to be able to carry the load that you're demanding of it. But science doesn't tell you anything about what the materials you should use, what the building should look like. You got all sorts of other concerns, like what aesthetically is pleasing to you, what the function of the building is going to be, what your budget is. All of these other factors come into play, and science has nothing to say about the constraints that are imposed there. So science imposes these very, very loose boundary conditions. And I think architecture is a useful metaphor in this way, that an architecture is sort of like if you don't pay attention to the science, some attention to the science, disaster befalls you, the building falls down. That may be too extreme in education. But you have some similar sorts of constraints that are pretty absolute. Something like, if you want to gain expertise, practice is going to be essential. If you want to understand what you're reading, some background knowledge about the topic is essential. These are non-negotiable, but they don't say anything about what the practice needs to look like, what the schedule of practice should be, how you're going to practice, how you're going to acquire the background knowledge. Doesn't say anything about that. So what I'm trying to do here as I'm ready to wind up, what I'm trying to do here is find new ways of talking about the relationship between basic science and educational practice that I think better reflects the reality, which is basic science is useful, but it doesn't come close to prescribing practice. And this also gets at this idea that I frequently hear from teachers where they're told you have to do this because the research indicates that you must do this. I'd say the research never does that. So that doesn't make any sense. There are always options. So this is now just a review slide of where we started. This is the overview of the talk. So I'm going to leave it there, and it looks like we've got lots. I may have talked really fast. Looks like we've got lots of times for questions and comments, which I'm excited to hear what y'all have to say.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Willingham. At this point, Jason and I will relay questions the participants wrote into the chat feature of Zoom. Keep sending those in. I see almost full-blown conversations going on in the chat box, which is great. Our first question was, and this is going to be a two-parter because people were having almost a conversation with each other. That was a good one. And this is it. As someone who's worked on both the research and the teaching public school side of things, I think something that's overlooked is access to research after university training. With few exceptions, teachers and people who work in schools want to do what is best for kids. They're taught a set of knowledge during their teacher training, and then once they start practicing, typically rely on school district provided continuing education. It's at the district and state offices of public instruction level that drive what practicing teachers are exposed to. can you talk to this? And before you talk to this, there's this other piece that I do think is important that was piggybacking on that. This is another, Etienne points this out. She said, almost, also often the continuing education districts provide it's from publishing companies who have consultants, not research or experts. I've dealt with this myself. Deliver training that is essentially rehearsed script. Sometimes these are great and well-researched, other times not. And for teachers like myself who do not want to read the latest research in journals and do not have access to that because of paywalls, that's all we can depend on. So if you could speak to all of that.
Yeah, you tax my working memory. I love this question. I mean, this is getting right at the heart of what I've been talking about and what I'm so concerned about. I mean, the way I frequently frame the point that that was made is like, it's weird that I've been doing what I've been doing for the last 15 years, right? So for those of you, well, I don't know why any of you would know this. So I started my life as a basic researcher. I wasn't interested in education at all. And about 10 years in, I started getting interested in applications of cognitive psychology to research, to education. And crucially, I made the decision very, very early. I wasn't going to do it within the academy. I was just going to communicate directly with teachers, because my first exposure to teachers and cognitive psychology was they didn't know any of this and they were extremely interested. So what that told me was we researchers are doing a terrible job. And that's exactly what the question was. When you think about it, it's not obviously anyone's job to be taking basic research, translating and saying, here's the bits and pieces that I think could be interesting to you. You need to know the research, and you also need to understand classrooms. When I first started doing this, I spent about 3 years doing nothing, not writing, not doing anything, just observing classrooms. Also helped a lot that I'm married to a teacher, so I would talk with her a lot about classrooms. So trying to sort of get in the mindset of teachers about what would be useful from my field. So to finally get to an answer, this is all just me being excited about your question. To get to what maybe is a useful answer is, this is exactly what I was getting at, is that you don't have access to research because this should be someone's job. It should be part of the profession. And what I'm suggesting is the person whose job it ought to be is someone, it should be someone hired by a professional organization. Like AFT should have 3 people, 5 people, something like that on staff who are doing nothing except providing exactly the kind of information that you just asked about. This also gets at the question of quality. Now, in some larger districts, there is someone who is the point person for this. Frequently their title will be, assistant superintendent for curriculum instruction, or in some districts I've visited, they have research in their name or something like that. Candidly, the extent to which they're awesome at their job varies, but I mean, that's sort of always true. But it's definitely true that unless you're in a large enough district, they can't carry the cost of that. And they're just one person. They don't have a lot of time to do a lot of writing. They're serving as consultants when there's a teacher committee that's trying to choose a new ELA curriculum for early elementary or something like that. And then they're the ones who are selecting the people for PD to come in. And I feel sympathy for that person when it comes to selecting who to pick for PD, because it's pretty hard to tell. Right? There should really be like a Yelp or something for PD. So like after the fact, you can say like, okay, that person had no idea what they were talking about. I should maybe not, I do some PD, so maybe I should not broadcast that idea so broadly that I think that there ought to be a Yelp. Anyway, that's probably enough on that.
Thank you very much. So I'll ask one. I think everybody can see that the chat box is exploding, so there's a zillion questions and we only have time for some. But the second question relates a little bit to what you were saying, Dr. Willingham, and the question is a conglomerate of a few people. So one person said that the National Council of Teachers of English, NCTE, I think even in your book you also mentioned NCTM for math, does review and translate research for teachers, but unfortunately they don't always recognize or prioritize high standards of empirical research. And then riffing off of that, someone said, hey, that's a great vision, super smart.
Yeah.
But how can we deal with an institution such as the International Literacy Association, who's often directed practitioners to disproven theories about early word acquisition in journals and conferences?
Yeah, I want to acknowledge this is a significant problem. And it again sort of gets at, like, there are lots of people who are saying they're researchers, and in many cases, practitioners are saying, like, I'm a little suspicious about the extent to which you are all comparable researchers. Certainly you're saying different things and you're all claiming the mantle of research. I think that one thing that could be useful would be for people at the very least in different disciplines to be candid about what methods they champion, what they take the goals of education to be, and crucially, what they think they have to contribute to education and what problems are sort of off the table for them. This is something I've written multiple times. I think cognitive psychology can be very useful, but cognitive psychology is very useful to a little fraction of education. I think it's decisive, but most of education, cognitive psychology has nothing to say about it. So I think we need to be, I think it would help if all of us who claim to be researchers would be upfront about what we actually mean by research, how we take different sorts of evidence, and then what sorts of problems we think that the research that we engage in, what sorts of problems it can help solve. That might be pretty pie in the sky. I would love to see it turn into the kind of thing where if a few organizations took the lead and said, this is what we believe, we're sort of planting our flag here, that consumers of research would come to expect that and demand it when they're not getting it.
Okay, thank you. I've got another kind of two-parter because, again, there was a little bit of a conversation, but there was a common theme in it. One attendee points out that there are many misconceptions out there about what a theory really is. Some theories are well-grounded in empirical research, integrate studies into a cohesive whole, and can be very helpful in predicting behavior or guiding instructional practices. Other theories, of course, are a little more, fly-by-night conjectures. It seems to me that it's important for teachers to know the difference. That was one kind of comment, and then there was a question somewhat related to that. The idea of favoring empirical regularities over theory is very helpful. Curious as to what you see as the role of theory in practice or professional development. That is, what is theory's place?
Yeah, so I elaborate on this at great length in that paper that I just flashed up there, and in a couple of other papers. So what I argue, the theories are really developed to move science forward. Theories are not developed to be useful to practitioners. And as such, one important characteristic of a theory is that a theory is going to generate novel predictions. A theory is not only supposed to capture existing data, it's supposed to go beyond existing data so that it can make testable, falsifiable predictions. This is not useful to practitioners. And another characteristic of theories is that because they need to make precise predictions, they frequently are pretty impenetrable. It takes a while to sort of wrap your mind around them. That's not a deal breaker, but it means like they really ought to pay off. If you're asking a practitioner to master a theory that's pretty abstract and weird, then you really want to be persuaded this is going to pay off in some important way for the practitioner. And what I've argued is the theories that scientists develop don't fulfill these characteristics at all. They're meant for scientists, and scientists and practitioners put theories to different use. What a practitioner needs is a theory that is going to take all those empirical regularities, make them easy to remember, make them cohere together so that you're not just memorizing a long list of learning phenomena. And I've suggested the way you could have a theory that's sort of a simplified sort of central tendency of researchers' theories that would be useful to practitioners. So that's the role that I think theory should play. And when it comes to fly-by-night theories, fly-by-night always sounds bad, right? So I'd say no, there's not a good role for fly-by-night theories.
Great, thank you. Another question. It's a little bit different from what we've been asking. So here's the question. It says, there are a good number of people, like academics, politicians, consultants, experts and so on, who seem to really turn education into profit with pseudoscientific and scientific panaceas to profile themselves.
Yeah.
And I guess this person's quoting you and saying those earmarks that are easy to acquire, as you put it so well. Is it perhaps because education is so hard to put aside from politics and business at large?
I'm not sure. I mean, this is out. I'm spitballing here because this is really outside my area of expertise. My impression has been that, it's not different than medicine in this way, that medicine is full of quack cures. And so again, we don't want to hold up like the physicians have got this all figured out. They don't. I mean, there people have weird beliefs about it. And when something is highly valued and you've got significant difficult problems, as you do in medicine, you're going to see people with quick schemes that separate people from money. And people are willing to spend money on their health. And there is a significant amount of money available in education, though I recognize it often feels like there's not. People are opportunists. I think that's going to persist.
This is a more general question. Somebody writes, I've heard that there's not a lot of funding for educational research. Dr. Willingham, this is something you've talked about in one of your books. Who will fund these ideas, and who should be taking steps, and what steps should they be moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, the key idea that I put forward, first of all, what I've suggested researchers do is not costly. I've suggested that researchers talk differently about their research. A lot of times people bring up the idea that because most researchers work within the academy, that there ought to be sort of different rules of the game within the academy, that you would sort of earn academic brownie points for doing communication with teachers. That's a really heavy lift to try and change the academy. So I don't think that's all that realistic. That's why I suggest that when we talk about costs, I think that organizations of practitioners that are large, that have a lot of influence, for them to take on the cost of this sort of effort, I don't think would be really very significant at all. I think it would be seen as a benefit by practitioners. And so I think it's something they could easily do if they cared to take it on.
Great. Next question is from a school administrator and says, in your book, Why Don't Students Like School? You said that the cognitive conditions have to be right for thought. Otherwise, humans will avoid thinking. What are the cognitive conditions that school leaders should create in their schools to ensure that colleagues can think and therefore can question educational research myths, etc.?
And therefore question education research?
Myths, yeah.
Education myths.
Right.
I think they're already question. Well, yeah. That's a great question, and I don't think I have a ready answer. I think they already question research. Interestingly enough, I mean, I think that's a rephrasing of what I had said before. That people generally like to retain their beliefs and are reluctant to change their beliefs. So getting people to challenge their own beliefs, I mean, that's usually not going to happen. That usually is going to have to happen from the outside. Someone is going to have to invite you to re-examine this belief. And this is what I said right at the very front end of the talk. Okay, that's actually not what I'm going to talk about, though it might sound like I am. This really is a matter of persuasion. If someone strongly believes in the learning pyramid, how do you get them to change their mind? And it's a multifaceted answer. You and I were talking about this issue in preparation for this webinar, and I was saying that I think that the literature within educational psychology on science education is especially informative here, because people looking at how children learn new ideas within science that replace existing ideas. So they have beliefs, naive beliefs about physics, That's the field. It's not that the kids are naive. The field is sort of called naive physics. And how you replace that, it's very difficult and takes a lot of systematic work. So I'll probably just leave that there.
Okay. So this is a question from somebody coming from the UK. Obviously, there are issues in education globally, but it seems you're mostly discussing these options for an institution within the USA. And I'm wondering if you've seen any examples of something similar that's working a bit in another country. In the UK, we have the TES, which isn't specifically educators or researchers, but more so journalists that bring these two together in articles, and many teachers read those things. It's not quite what you mean, but it is a step. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was very much talking in the American context, and my thought is that I don't know enough about the context in other countries to comment, so I won't. Sorry about that, British friends.
No, that's fair. Thank you. Let me see. This person says that, so there's a person who says that as a department chair in a high needs school, I've seen and even hired a fair number of career switchers who have little to no educational courses or teaching background. Have you seen any programs or districts who have done a good job giving a crash course in education that helps new teachers not simply rely on anecdotal experience?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, and the short answer is no. I don't know. I don't have a ready-made, like, I know that there are districts who do this well. It's enormously challenging, and I've talked with a lot of administrators and teachers as well who point out, like, you talk a lot about schools of education, and like we're zooming people into the classroom much more quickly than we would like to, because of high need. Yeah, so my experience in this is fairly limited. So I'll just briefly say, I know that there are districts where they feel like they're doing a pretty good job with this, but I don't know in detail exactly what they're doing, so I don't feel prepared to comment on it.
Now, this is a question you have addressed before in your work, so I thought it'd be worth talking about.
Yeah.
This is the question. I wonder what your take is on educational psychology courses focus on older work, especially on detailing the history of the development of psychology as a discipline, rather than focusing on newer empirical work from which we can derive more practical implications for the classroom.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the sort of very brief version of my answer to this is, this is a course that's preparing future researchers. It's not preparing practitioners. I can think of reasons why you would, be asked to learn theories that are decades out of date, and then, sort of follow up with all the reasons we now know that theory isn't right. You want to learn sort of who the giants of the field were, or at least you can make a case for learning who the giants of the field were, if you're going to be a researcher and you're going to be sort of immersed in the whole landscape of research. If you've got lots of other courses that you're taking, my goal is to be a really effective early elementary reading instructor, then, it's not, I don't really need to know all that much psychology. I need to know the bit of psychology that is actually going to help me do my job better. So I can't think of a good argument for learning the broad sweep of the field. I mean, it's a nice idea in a way that you would learn the broad sweep of psychology and sociology and labor economics and all these other fields that somehow touch on education. But again, to me, it seems really idealistic to suppose that one individual from very brief exposure to all these fields, this sort of wine tasting of fields, it's all going to coalesce and gel into this, really rich insight into how to teach children how to read. I just, as someone who studies learning, I just don't, it doesn't work that way.
Thank you. We have 3 more minutes left that we want to do. So I think we probably have room for another 1 or maybe 2 questions.
I'll talk
Here's
fast.
the next question.
Okay.
The question is, deep budget cuts to education are coming to our state. Our governor has already eliminated 14% off the bat across all budget line items. Our schools are going to have to get lean and mean really fast, which to me means that schools are going to have to get more efficient at a rapid pace. My question is this: how does one go about drawing schools toward better practices, like in reading specifically, without pointing out the flaws in their present results? For example, recent NAEP scores.
Well, it's an interesting way of posing the question, because the front end of the question is all about becoming more efficient, but then the question itself was about how do you not point out problems? You know, to me, it's you can't improve without feedback. If you need to know what your goal is, and you need to know where you are currently, and then you need to figure out a path to how you're going to get closer to your goal. NAEP scores may or may not be crucial to figuring out what you want to work on. It really depends on, it really does depend on, you know, what you want to work on. The other thing that strikes me when I think about, you know, budget cuts coming, and how to sort of move people towards good practices, I'm not sure budget cuts qualitatively really change that task, because I mean, I think everybody wanted to be efficient from the start. Everybody wanted to be effective, and everybody wanted to use, you know, best practices, whatever they might be, from the start. Budget cuts make things more urgent and mean that we need to make very difficult choices, but I'm not sure it qualitatively changes what our job has been.
Okay, this is one that you said this was not really about, but it still kind of has to be addressed at some point, which is persuasion.
Yes.
You know, persuasion is a tricky thing. What advice would you give teacher educators when they find themselves combating the types of myth you described? What has worked for you?
Well, I'll be brief because I'm aware of the time. I think one of the things that's really important is that most of the time when people believe things, they've got reasons for believing them. The reasons are not always because they want their beliefs to be in tune with the world. That is one of the reasons we believe what we believe. And we think it's the only reason we believe what we believe. I believe things because, you know, they're true. That's why I believe them. We actually have many other reasons. We believe things for emotions, for emotional regulations. In other words, we avoid some beliefs because entertaining that as true terrifies us. We see this in climate change denial, for example. We believe things for reasons of solidarity, social reasons, because lots of other people who we think are like us and who we esteem believe those things. And sometimes we believe things because they seem consistent with very deeply held values we might call sacred. So the first thing, if you're trying to persuade someone, is you need to have a good idea of why it is that they actually believe this, and start from the idea that they may not believe it because the evidence, but just because of the evidence. That said, they're going to come back at you with evidence. Okay, so because we all think that we only believe things because the evidence indicates it, what you can end up is you and I are fighting about the evidence, and I'm like, this doesn't make any sense what this person is saying. It may not, but I'm totally talking past you because I'm not really getting at the core reason that you hold this belief. So when you're thinking about persuasion, you need to think about why the person actually believes it. And the other thing you need to do is, if you want to be heard, you really need to accord this person some respect. And this is something that comes up, you know, especially on social media platforms. People very quickly get very combative, and they get very ugly, and they don't, you know, it's very plain from their attitude that, you know, I think you're kind of an idiot, you know, if you believe this. I've laid out the truth for you, and yet you don't pick it up and thank me for the education I'm offering. So no one is going to listen to you if you don't try and get in their head and recognize why this thing that you think is false makes sense to them. Yet that really needs to be your starting point. And the third thing I would say is you need to be persistent. The idea that, you know, I'm going to have one conversation with you, I'll explain it to you, and then you'll believe it. And then you'll say, thank you for turning on that light bulb. That's extremely unrealistic. A lot of times if I've got a core belief and I'm going to change it, that's going to be something I need to sneak up on. So if you're trying to persuade me, you need to come at me, give me something to think about, you know, plant a seed and then back off and then let me sort of think about it. And then you come back and you're like, okay, that seed died. Let's try another one. But maybe that seed didn't die. Maybe I did, you know, turned it over in my mind and it sort of started to make sense to me. And now I'm receptive to more conversation with you about it.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Willingham. Thanks everybody, but this is all we have time for today. Dr. Willingham, thank you very, very much for spending an hour and some change with us. We also thank our attendees for joining on Zoom, even though you've spent hours and hours of your time in these past 2.5 months on Zoom. And finally, thanks to our Division 15 webinar committee for helping us throughout the planning process. Thanks again, everyone. Feel free to check back on our Division 15 website in about a day or two. The recording for this webinar will be there, and we look forward to your continued interaction and engagement with that. Dr. Willingham, thank you so very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you all very much for having me, and thanks to everyone who attended.
Great. Bye. Cheers.